So, our psychedelic door flew open and our senses became heightened, and time warped and colors were brighter. This is Annie Sprinkle, a porn star turned sex educator, artist, and environmentalist. And she's describing an encounter with a lover where they hadn't actually taken any drugs. I wonder if people who've never done any psychedelics could ever feel the same way, or if our psychedelic experiences enabled us to enhance and intensify the magical feelings of love, she said. In other words, do we necessarily calibrate our new experiences in terms of our previous ones? And if we do, then what advantages does widening the perceptual frameworks that we have bring us? And can we possibly do that through discussion? Well, the answer to the last one is an emphatic yes, and that's what the semantric sessions is. And one of the main things that we've been thinking about throughout devising this course is how our collective ability to put into language recapitulates back into our experience and increases the possibilities for the depth and complexity that we can bring to them. And I believe this is just as true for sex as it is for psychedelics. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so happy to have both Britta Love and Alex Aldridge here with us today, because both are shining consciousness on aspects of combining sex with drugs in ways that make them possible to discuss and to widen our perceptual frameworks in relation to as a result. And not only this, but their work is resulting in the translation of that knowledge into the culture that we live in and that their findings are gathered in ways that are going to change it for the better. So Alex Aldridge collects empirical data about the ways people are having sex on drugs and how this relates to consent in her doctoral studies at Royal Holloway. And she translates this into possible initiatives for safer nightlife culture. And Britta Love is a sex workers' rights activist and a somatic sex educator. And she not only guides individuals through transformative renegotiating of their experiences that somatic experiencing can bring, but also works as a circle keeper with the Planning Change Restorative Justice Certification Program. So she is changing the collective consciousness around consent and sexual behavior while also healing and empowering individuals. Now, I'd like to preface this discussion with some thoughts on the idea that the extent to which we consciously engage with what we're doing with sex and drugs determines how readily we can open up possibilities for interpretation and personalization. So there are many different kinds of engagement with sex as with drugs, and questions I've been thinking about in relation to this are you the kind of person who likes to know exactly what's going on in the brain and body when you take acid, the extent of the galvanic skin response you're likely to have? Or do you tune more into the subjective effects? Are you more visual or more sonic? And it's all very well being open about sex in the sense of being comfortable using crude terms, but actively personalizing the conversation you have around sex in exactly the same way as we just did with drugs enables you to explore how different options relate to you and why you find them pleasurable, both in terms of psychology and physiology. And both sex and drugs have the potential to increase openness, but it depends on the kind of sex and on what drugs. Are you using them to enhance your visual processing and increase alertness, or maybe as an anesthetic or an anxiolytic? And then there's the sex itself. Is the connection between you center stage in the sex you craft, or are you more focused on the acts themselves and the props? And what prominence do sex and drugs have in your self-narration and your shared narration of the experience? And how important to you is it that there is a shared sense of narration? And can we undergo somatic recategorization, perhaps as a result of trauma release and greater self-knowing around the physical side of sex? Does the ability to acknowledge the source of the trauma coming into greater consciousness as it leaves your body bring about a point at which you can acknowledge it and come to a point of semantic recategorization, or kind of reinterpreting an encounter that had once been surprising as one that was non-consensual? Now, our collective confidence in such kinds of recategorization and reappraisal, and in the fact that we have the right to perspectives which shift over time, grows as these topics come into prominence in the collective consciousness. So we talk about body language and reading cues, but it's worth bringing consciousness to the fact that sex itself can be a language, albeit one where not so much is necessarily languaged in words. So separately and together, sex and drugs have historically been stigmatized. Another reason, combined with the fact that not necessarily verbalizable things can be communicated in both through their own kinds of coding, with the fact that the topic of sex on drugs is shrouded in verbal mystery. So, as well as presenting everyone who enters with an unsignposted carnival of possibilities, this darkness holds so much scope for enormous innovation and creativity and healing. And so one thing I'd like to touch on in this discussion is a question of what's in the light. And I know that Alex's work very much arose from an awareness that chemsex, or the idea that men have sex with men using a small amount of the wide range of chemicals on offer, was kind of the only portal to which sex on drugs was being presented to the world at large through the mainstream media. And her work is a ongoing voyage through all of the different kinds of sex and drugs to diversify and complexify this topic. And another narrative where there's a disjunct between the reality of what's represented in literature is non-consensual sex, where there's such a diversity and complexity of experience, and it's done such a disservice by the two-dimensional constructs around it that plague the media, particularly in relation to spiking, both in terms of how harm reduction practices with no rooting in reality are devised, and also how painful these concepts can be for survivors to come up against as they navigate something far more subtle and difficult to language. And if we don't update our collective capability to have these conversations, then how can we ever hope to review the systems that reliably keep producing these experiences? And it is with that that I would love to open up the conversation on language and drugs and consent with Britta and Alex. And what I'd love to start by asking you both to speak about is, I've got a few questions for both of you, then a few questions for each of you. But one of the ones for both of you is around the importance of language in relation to consent, and how important it is in relation to the establishment of consent. So I'm thinking about Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent, which is a really important way of calibrating this concept, but it feels very rooted in language. And then there's such a wide selection of different possible circumstances, for instance, maybe where language can only be written or signed, or perhaps when you have a psychedelic in the mix and there's so much more going on that feels like it doesn't need to necessarily be languaged in words. But then also you can get situations where there's a power dynamic going on where consent is very much established in words, but then there are also other agencies potentially being overridden despite the words being used. So yeah, I'm just really curious about how language plays into consent as you find it in your work, both of you.
I can hop on first. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yes. No, I was just going to suggest that maybe Britta, in view of drawing on the wheel of consent for that question, you might like to open.
Sure. And thanks so much for having me here. Yeah, I think I would probably, you touched on so many things just there, but I think I'm gonna zoom out for a second just to sort of explain what the wheel of consent is a little bit, and how it sort of changes how we look at consent, because in our cultural kind of the culturally dominant, and how it sort of changes how we look at consent, because in our cultural kind of the culturally dominant model, we're sort of looking at consent as sort of like a gatekeeping model of, do I have permission? And then once I have permission, then we just sort of, continue from there. And there's not a sort of ongoing checking in, and there's not sort of an idea of a collaboration and an agreement. It's sort of more of a permission model. And so the wheel of consent sort of tries to really break down our social interactions and help us understand not just sort of who's doing what and whether they have permission, but also who is it for? And when you start looking at the difference between, so for example, if you're giving someone a massage, you might assume if someone's massaging someone else's neck that it's for the person whose neck it is, they're receiving the massage. But that's not true. I can be touching for my own pleasure, right? I could be enjoying the sensation of physically massaging another person, and they might actually find it uncomfortable or not be enjoying it. So what the wheel of consent tries to do is break apart who's doing from who it's for, and really understand the 4 different experiences that we have in all relating, not just through through touch, but just there's the experience of taking for our own pleasure, which is a doing action, and there's also the serving of for someone else's pleasure, which is also a doing action, and then vice versa. There's receiving that is for us for our own pleasure, and there's also allowing someone to take their pleasure from us, which can be totally fine if it's in consent. So there's those 4 quadrants, and so the wheel is really a model that breaks that down. And when you start to try to break that down, we notice that we have a lot of discomfort, different ones of us with different people with different parts of that wheel. And so it's like my brain wants to go in 3 different directions at once right now, because I want to touch on so many of the things that you brought up. One thing is that quite often we're patterned to embodied patterns that we're not fully conscious of towards consent, towards entitlement or submission. And so one of the things that we start to learn is that verbal consent is kind of limited when we kind of have these autonomic kind of nervous system responses where we're patterned to, to appease or fawn or to freeze. And that a lot of times consent and our understanding of whether we consented to something changes as we come out of an experience and realize that we were in one of those trauma responses, and that we kind of just went into a submission mode. And so that we could even sort of say, okay, or like kind of nod, or just sort of not say no, and then come out of an experience and feel violated, like we had something non-consensual happening. And I think quite often cultural narratives around consent are so focused on, did you get a yes? Did someone say a no? Did they fight back? And it doesn't allow for all this complex nuance of how the power dynamics involved are playing out, and people's trauma histories, and I include within that the traumatic socialization entered into gender norms in our culture, which, this isn't a one-to-one thing. There's plenty of people who are socialized as, as female who don't have this experience, and vice versa. But there is an overall patterning in our culture to socialize women who are people who are assigned female at birth as, submit, be quiet, endure, and so those are kinds of patterns that show up when we're interacting, where language can be both a really necessary thing for us to learn to use to navigate, and also a very difficult thing to. And so to get behind the layers of what we're experiencing in those interactions, the wheel of consent asks us to really break down our interactions. And within the exercises that we do in these workshops and teachings, it's really about slowing down and then figuring out, how do we know what we want? Because that's something that we take for granted, like quite often right away. Like, okay, do you want this to happen? And is it a yes or a no? And quite often, for me, we get taught to sort of break down the noticing, then the trusting that we've noticed something, then the valuing that it's worth doing something about, and then the communicating as 4 different steps on in how we actually get to the point where we're actually even expressing our consent or non-consent. So I think I'll leave it there for now, but like that's kind of how I look at how to break down some of the trauma-informed and somatically informed and just internal processes that we have to understand better in order to even get to the point where we're going to decide, okay, I'm going to express this verbally or non-verbally in some way that I am consenting or not consenting.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful and full answer, and the sense of kind of the trauma histories and social precedents playing out in an encounter and how that can lead to less dialogue in the moment makes so much sense. And then also, of course, like the overemphasis on, did you get a yes, did you get a no? Alex, how does language play out in your findings around consent in your work and the data that you collect?
Hi. Yeah, thanks as well for having me here. It's already been so interesting to hear what's been said. Yeah, I guess I have a few kind of random thoughts that I'll try and like pull together. But I want to preface it by saying that I do really appreciate and acknowledge the work that has kind of gone into, I guess maybe, I don't know how to say this, but like expand like what consent is and what, you know, what consent covers, you know, like to take into consideration power dynamics, you know, considering your own consent and other consent and stuff like that, you know, broader than that dominant understanding of consent just as like permission, just as yes or no permission in the moment. So I really appreciate that work that's been done. However, I find that, you know, through my work, you know, researching with people and like I also work as like a welfare officer in kind of nightclubs with dark rooms where sex on drugs is happening. In those spaces, the dominant understanding of consent is still that dominant understanding where consent, you know, is permission. And, you know, as I think, you know, lots of people here would think, like the language of consent tends to be quite narrowing. So, you know, when we talk about consent in this mainstream way, we are kind of by definition talking about, you know, an interaction between maybe two people, maybe more people at a particular moment or moments in time. And so like basically the spatial and temporal parameters of discussion are kind of reduced and less context can be taken into consideration. So I guess what I'm saying is like, even the, so let me give some examples to try and like make clearer what I'm saying. So I work at a nightclub in London that has, it's not explicitly a sex club, but it has a playroom, and the playroom is, you know, for all genders and sexualities, because we kind of acknowledge that a lot of like dark room playroom spaces historically tend to be dominated by, you know, like cis gay men. So it's kind of important to create like these spaces that can be more diverse. And as such, we have like a list of rules that you read before you go in. So this kind of comes back to language where it's like a verbal or non-verbal thing. In a nightclub space, it is obviously really loud. Like you can't really speak to each other. You can't really verbally communicate. That's why we have all the rules kind of printed out, stuck on the wall, so you can read it even when like the music is really blasting. So like, but then we have written up there like consent is key, but what we don't have written up on that list, just because there isn't the space or time, is, you know, what is consent is like, it's more than that. All the things that you were just saying, I think like really effectively, we can't fit that onto a piece of paper. We can't explain that on the door of a playroom. And so people take their own understanding of consent into that room, and then that plays out as it will. And in nightclub spaces, like consent norms are so different. Like I just came from a party on New Year's Day that is in London, and it's called Adonis, and like the name might suggest, it's kind of, you know, targeted for gay men, and the dark room there is like a different world. Like I couldn't even go in, and consent in that space, my friend who was in that dark room said consent in that space is having an erection. Like there's no communication, you know, it's like eye contact, you know, you see someone, they're maybe like wanking, you go up to them, like you have sex. Whereas in our dark room, it's like I had to ask a man who was wanking to leave because he was kind of like wanking next to this group of people who he hadn't asked for their consent. But then in the Adonis dark room, that would have been totally fine. So it's just like, it's so deeply contextual, and everyone brings their own understandings of it. So I guess I think, to summarize kind of everything that I've said, which I felt was a bit messy and all over the place, just saying the language of consent is, in its dominant understanding, restrictive. People bring their own understandings of it, even when it is communicated on a piece of paper on the door that you have to get consent. And I don't really know what to do about it. Do you know what I mean? Like it's hard, and you know, when you are working as a welfare officer in that space, trying to ensure like everything is consensual and good, I feel like almost focusing on consent restricts you, and we have to like move beyond it or introduce some other concepts to work alongside it to help us. not necessarily sure what those concepts are, but like on its own, I don't think it has the ability to like do the work that it needs to create like ethical and fulfilling sexual encounters, especially when drugs are involved. Unless, you know, unless people do have this expanded understanding, but for the most part, people don't. But yeah.
I really love the phrase expanded understanding, and just in general, the kind of the juxtaposition of what can be written on a wall versus what can be communicated, and then like the nuances of the different spaces and how important that calibration of nuances between people. And I loved how much, so much of your answers related to like the worlds that each other's working in as well. And one of the things that I was thinking about in both of your answers is this idea of consent changing over time, and kind of your recalibration of an encounter where you might go in with your preconditioning and not say no or even say yes, and then kind of afterwards the alchemization of that perception and the taking on of kind of a deepening level of awareness of how it actually was for you, and of kind of how it's situated within society and wider power dynamics. And yeah, I'm wondering what you both have encountered within your work in terms of kind of the release of trauma and then the retrospective recategorization of experiences, and how you think that that kind of works within the collective consciousness, what should happen in the light of this unfolding awareness, and kind of what you think its implications are in terms of people like making sure that they don't have those kind of encounters or deliver those kind of encounters, like how it can feed back into changed behavior or kind of a collective recalibration of what consent is.
I can jump in. I love this conversation, and it feels like it you know, just to respond briefly to what Alex just said, which I thought was so important, and I thought might come up in this conversation when I saw where Alex's work is based and how you're sort of doing harm reduction work out in the real world, in the culture as it is now. And that's very different than being in workshop spaces where people are going, trying to come together, or one-on-one healing spaces to try to shift their understanding and heal and change. And so I think it's kind of like, you know, I think of the work that I'm doing in the world as sort of like the sort of hopefully enough people coming into the spaces and doing that work supports being able to have that more enriched definition of consent that more people have an understanding of. And sort of, but in the meantime, we need something written on the wall of the door, you know, that, so we need both. And it's like that dance of like, how much can we change culture? And then can we connect those spaces? Can we have, you know, short embodied consent workshops that are associated with the nightlife scene that, you know, feed back into what people are experiencing, and how can we connect those worlds? And I think that's so important. Now I'm just forgetting what Rosalind's question was because I got excited. But it was about right, the changes in our understanding of consent.
Retrospective recategorization of experience as your own somatic awareness deepens, and as you learn more about what it might have been as your perception widens, and yeah, how that can work in society as we approach consent better.
Totally, thank you. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's something that I've seen both in people who I've worked with who, you know, as one comes to heal trauma and come out of like long-term kind of states of dissociation, it can be kind of a really alarming thing to realize that, wow, I don't think the majority of my sexual experiences have actually been for me, or like fully consensual by this more expanded definition. Not like I was fighting back, but more like I was just in that appease or freeze mode, and I felt like I needed to do what the other person wanted. And that can be this huge shift in understanding. I mean, and on like a very personal level, like over the like, I guess 15 years that I've been sort of moving through the worlds of sexual healing, I had completely recategorized and experienced my first sexual experience from something that I would have said was like sort of consensual and not necessarily what I wanted, to actually that was a major consent violation. And it the problem becomes we live in this culture where we're in a very much a binary around perpetrator and victim and guilt and innocence and good and bad with regards to how we interact sexually. And I think that there's there's obvious a place for that. If you're Harvey Weinstein out in the world, like there needs to be a place for accountability for serial perpetrators of sexual harm that are very consciously and deliberately pursuing those kinds of aggressive dynamics. But that binary really fails us in the complexity of human experiences and how we change and notice things changing over time. And what I really appreciate about the transformative justice and restorative justice spaces that I've spent time in is it really flattens that binary so that there's space to say that we're all going to commit harm as humans. Like that is by definition part of being human, is that at points in our lives we are going to harm others, often without knowing or meaning to. And so when you kind of broaden that out, if we're all in a space where we're receptive to hearing that and coming to understand how we did that and what we could do to prevent that happening again, then we can flatten that sort of victim perpetrator binary that in some cases can be useful, but in a lot of more nuanced cases isn't so much, because it creates this sort of defensiveness and this reason to sort of not investigate what happened in that encounter for me to leave this other person feeling this way. And we go into states of shame and spiraling and defensiveness. And this is like really normal, because our sense of social acceptance and belonging historically, evolutionarily, was our survival. So being exiled from the group as a predator, as someone who has committed harm, could be a matter of life or death. And so it brings up a lot in folks to hear, in me and anyone, I think, to hear that, oh, this person was harmed by me. And so what the sort of restorative and transformative justice model does is it tries to create spaces where we're able to be lovingly supported by community in investigating how something like that took place. And that still means there needs to be accountability, particularly if there's a power dynamic or the person who's committing the harm is in a position of power in a community, that it's going to be appropriate to step back from that position, at least for the duration of time that it takes, which should be significant, to really understand how that happened, go into therapeutic and other spaces to unpack that, rework through those patterns. And it may or may not ever be appropriate for that person to quite hold that level of power again. But it's not without consequence. It's not sort of like we all get together and just sort of say, oh, I'm sorry, and now we just, continue on. But it's not this exiling, blacklisting, you are now a trash human, kind of model that doesn't allow us. So that's kind of how I think how we kind of can adjust for having these experiences where our understanding of harm has changed over time, because I can understand also how it could be really confusing for someone who felt they were engaging consensually with someone who was in a freeze response. And yes, you should ideally be looking for very affirmative consent and checking in with your partner and learning how to be more attuned and all of those things. But inevitably, there are going to be times when that fails and we have a disconnect and we didn't realize, or one person state of inebriation wasn't recognizable to the others, or whatever the case may be. And having these very binary models where it was like, it was consensual. No, it was not consensual. And you're a perpetrator. That's not going to help us understand better what was taking place or shift the dynamics. So, yeah.
Shall I go? Yeah, okay. That was honestly so interesting. I like so many things I wanted to follow up what you said. I'm trying to think. I guess maybe as like a starting point, I think like the question like I try to ask when I'm ever presenting like maybe through written work or like at a conference or something, one of like my participants' sexual experiences is how to like talk about it in a way that can hold like multiplicities and like contradictory things at once, in a way that like feels like it captures the experience in a real way. So that does start, like you just said, with a reduction of binaries like victim and perpetrator, or consensual, non-consensual. It's really important. I guess in answer to this question, it might be, is it okay if I just tell a little story from a participant?
That sounds wonderful.
Cool. Yeah, because the question about kind of going back and reevaluating an experience and changing your opinion of it over time really resonates with one story in particular. So yeah, this is an experience of one of my participants. Her name was Spectre. It's not her real name, it's like the pseudonym she chose. When she took part in my research, she was 26, but she was describing an experience that happened to her when she was 16. And it was actually the story of what she thought of as her like virginity loss, like the night she lost her virginity. Yeah, so the day it happened, her original plan had been to fly to Scotland to meet this 30-year-old man that she'd met online, and she planned to have sex with him. She was really excited that, you know, she was like, I'm gonna lose my virginity to this man who I really love. Like, they hadn't met, you know, she was very infatuated with him. But just as she was about to board the plane to like fly to Scotland, he texted her and said, don't come. I think he'd maybe kind of thought, okay, I actually shouldn't meet this teenage girl and have sex with her, and, you know, called the whole thing off. So she's devastated, she's heartbroken. She decides to go to a house party with a friend of a friend. So people she kind of knows, but doesn't really know very well. And in, you know, classic teenage style, I think she stole like a bottle of Pimm's off her mum and just started to down it as the night progressed. She recalled getting drunker and drunker. And then suddenly at one point she was kissing this boy that she barely knew. He took her outside to an alleyway. They were kissing more. I think she called him Random Alley Guy in the story. She's giving him a blowjob in the alleyway, and she's given blowjobs before in her life. But this is the point where she has never gone further than that sexually. She goes back in without him. She's drinking more. Then she remembers going to the bathroom and she's throwing up in the toilet, but she doesn't close the bathroom door behind her. This boy follows her into the bathroom. Slight kind of content warning now. It's not like super extreme, but yeah, basically they're kissing. She feels sick, she's nauseous, she's just thrown up, she just wants it to be over, and he starts undressing her, and he says, do you want this, like, are you ready? And she says, yeah, because she's like, this will be, you know, this is the quickest way to end this. And just to really clarify, she made very clear in her story, she was not afraid of him. She did not feel threatened. If anything, she just felt vaguely annoyed by him. He was kind of small and boring to her. She had other things that are interesting her at the party. She just wanted rid of him. So she's not there feeling, you know, scared. She's just like, all right, let's just do this. They have sex. It's pretty uneventful. Like I said, he did ask her, are you ready for this? Do you want this? She says yes. It finishes. Her friends kind of find her in the bathroom, help her get dressed. She rejoins the party. About half an hour later, another boy takes her into his room. I think it might have even been the boy whose party it was. They have sex as well. It kind of plays out in a slightly similar way, except she remembered he, before they had penetrative sex, went down on her, gave her oral sex for maybe five minutes or something. And she recalled that being like good and soothing, she said, like she enjoyed it. No verbal consent before penetration. They have penetrative sex as well. He goes. So that's kind of it. She goes home after that. And in the immediate aftermath, she was like, she remembers being on the bus home afterwards and like playing angsty music on her headphone, because she's just like, I don't feel anything. Like, I just lost my virginity. I want to feel something. I want to feel like, you know, what feelings you should feel after losing your virginity. She doesn't. And then in the kind of like maybe years like year mark to maybe 3 years after, she really reevaluates, and she's like, this was sexual assault. I was sexually assaulted by those two men. I was way too drunk to consent. And I think the first guy went down and told everyone he had sex with me because I was so drunk, and then the second guy took advantage of my state and did that. And she felt a lot of anger about it. And she describes that as quite a dark time in her life, really, like the anger she felt around it. She felt it, you know, it kind of consumed her body. She was very angry at like many people about it. And then she kind of reevaluated again and found like just some level of comfort in taking some responsibility for what happened. She was like, no, actually, I can see where I made this decision here. And like, I can see how that decision I made played into what happened. And then she took part in the research, and what my participants did was they wrote diary entries of sex on drug experiences they had. So what I asked from them was like, you know, a chronological description of events. And before she took part in my research, she actually forgot that the second guy she had sex with went down on her. She'd forgotten about that part of it. And as she wrote it, she was like, do you know what, like I'm revisiting again, and I'm seeing there were actually parts of this, you know, overall quite horrible experience that were enjoyable, and this bit felt good and that bit was nice, and here I felt wanted and that was soothing, but like these bits were bad. So it was only through like really many engagements and re-engagements, and then a very like big engagement again with me that required a diary entry and an interview of talking through, where she was finally able to like hold it all together in a way that, like, I'm not saying now she's suddenly reached like the pinnacle of understanding. Like, I'm sure she'll continue to like reflect and think differently. But like, you know, at that moment in time, like when we discussed it together, I just felt like we were doing something where we could like let her be like this really complicated person who had made all these decisions and been in this context around other people who were making all these decisions in a way that like particularly women are just never allowed to be. Like we talked about binaries before, like for women in particular, it's kind of like, you know, passive victim or like, you know, active like slut basically. And she was like slut shamed for years and years and years after what happened. And she kind of felt like she had to own it and like kind of embody that role in order for it to be okay. And it's like I feel like the gendered dimensions are like really important here in this story. And like, I don't know, it's like when women are like complicated sexually, it's just so hard for them to like talk about it, and especially like in processing as well, like while you're still processing, to like narrate it in a way other than being a victim, and people want you to be a victim, and like or to be able to like be a victim but also have some responsibility, like, and for them not to cancel each other out. So I guess like, yeah, that's what like I want to, that's at least what I want to do. What, like when I tell people like my participants stories, I want like the complexity to be able to all be seen at once. But, and I feel like there are moments like when we get it, but then in the next moment it's all flattened out again. So it's just like how to maintain that is really hard. But yeah, that's what made me think of it. And then just one other thing I wanted to talk about, yeah, because you were talking about, Britta, you were talking about like the workshops you do and stuff. And I'm like you said, I'm not very like experienced in that kind of world at all. But in I think it was like 2017 maybe, I was invited to do a workshop at a sex club in Berlin with like clubbers, like nightclubbers. And it was especially like focused on GHB, because that's often seen as like the problem drug in like clubbing communities, especially in relation to consent. And it's like a chemsex drug too. But yeah, in that space, and I hadn't intended to do this at all, but what you said made me really think about it, was we all talked about times when we had like done something that had caused harm to someone. We're basically doing a panel, and then we kind of all went around and like shared times when, you know, we'd made someone feel uncomfortable, or maybe, you know, someone had like approached someone in a sex club and like in a way that had made that person feel bad, or like people had a sexual encounter in a sex club space and then maybe got a message on Facebook like the next day saying, you know what, actually like that wasn't good and blah blah blah. And it felt like, yeah, for a moment, like we created like quite a nice judgment. It wasn't like, well, it's not like it was judgment free, and there was some tension, you know, particularly like I remember one guy shared a story and like two people were kind of like, I felt like wanted him to leave, like, well, like that this was too much. So it's hard to like, and because I'm not like, you know, I'm not experienced in doing workshops like that. I don't think I really like properly had the tools to facilitate that discussion, but it did nevertheless happen. So I'd be so interested in like knowing more about how, yeah, like how I guess people like you who do those kinds of things and others like are able to facilitate a productive conversation where people are sharing like the harms they have caused without getting, like you said, you know, blacklisted, cancelled, whatever we want to call it, and like kicked out completely. Like, yeah, what does accountability look like? How, you know, and you know, how is it best? Yeah, that's it.
There's so many, if I can respond briefly, because there's so many good things in there. I think that's like such a good question, and a lot of the time the we don't have the spaces and the tools, and also the, you know, the idea of having a space where we can all see where we have committed harm versus maybe a space where there's been really egregious harm that maybe needs a little bit more of its own space surrounded by the immediate community of the people directly related to that situation, like the people who are present, the person who was harmed, their support people. So there's sort of different levels, I think, of like how deep into those kinds of experiences can be processed in a group where people maybe aren't all invested in each other or like that kind of community. But I just wanted to respond also to that story you shared, which was that participant, because that was so beautiful. And I agree that there's this lack of a lack of space for complexity and nuance around consent. And it's just something that I wanted to name that I see mirrored a lot in narratives around sex work, where there's a lot of similar kind of, you need to either be an empowered sex worker who just like loves their job and thinks this is the greatest thing to do on the planet, or you're a victim and you've been trafficked or it was against your will and you had no agency or choice in it whatsoever. And I think that reflects very much that binary that's particularly projected on people who are assigned female at birth as like, you don't get to have complexity of, well, I was trying to navigate the sexual situation and I kind of wanted to have sex, but I was also inebriated and didn't choose that person and didn't feel much choice in that moment, but there were some bits I did enjoy. Or, you know, I was trying to survive supporting my kid or getting through education, and I had some really unpleasant experiences with some clients that I would not chosen, that I'm still traumatized by, but I also am not a perfect victim of anyone else forcing me to do this, and it's a complex labor issue. So there's just like a lot of, I wanted just to bring that up because it connected the dots for me a little bit about the parallels that are often really difficult when we're talking about supporting sex workers' rights and finding the balance to navigate the harm that does happen in the sex industry, just like in the sexual world in general, without flattening it and to either total lack of agency and disempowerment, or you know, the perfect idealist experience. So thanks for that.
Thank you both for the amount of nuance and kind of different shades which you've brought to this question in so many ways. And I think particularly what I loved, Alex, in that story was the sense of remembering and kind of getting back lost parts of the memory that actually dappled it and made it have these different shades, and bringing in positivities and this process by which what had been kind of pure victimhood then became something much more complex, and she was like able to take more agency within the experience. And then I love, Britta, how that mirrors the experience of in sex work there being much more to it than just kind of trafficked victim or totally loving it all. And yes,
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, that was fascinating, and it just occurred to me that perhaps another really mundane, almost sort of day to day of understanding the nuance. I was thinking about if you're in a sort of relationship and you're not really in the mood, but you sort of go along with it, and you end up enjoying it, but you're not really in the mood, and that has some quite fine shades, and it's something that I think everyone experiences.
Yes, when it's taking place in this kind of supposed to be fine wraparound.
Yeah, it's section of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good and relatable point. And I think that experience is there's sort of different it's that context piece again, right? Like there's a certain amount of context where, because maybe you are an established couple or partnership that has sex on a regular basis, where there's maybe a little bit more wiggle room to see if we have a basic understanding that we kind of enjoy doing this, maybe are you in the mood to be seduced even though you weren't really feeling it. But again, that can also cover up a dynamic of entitlement or submission, or feeling just expected to come around to it if one partner is a bit more consistently pursuing it. So it's that breaking apart. And I think that the only way we kind of get to the only way, but one of the ways we really get to understand more about those interactions is sort of not looking to attribute it as like good or bad, or like entirely flattening it, but just sort of starting to investigate what our relational dynamic is with that person and just ourselves as we interact with people in general.
Shall we bring in the drugs? I really, really loved the paper that you wrote, Alex, that was called Intoxicating the Charmed Circle. And one of the things I loved about it was just this idea of how sober sex in some strange way is seen as kind of more valid and more important than sex on drugs, and kind of some types of sex being seen as more valid than others. And so I wanted to bring to both of you the idea of where in your work you find that different types of sex and different types of drug experiences with sex are seen as more valid, and which kinds of sex are seen as more real, whether in general there's a predisposition, Britta, in your work to see for people to see sex on certain drugs or without drugs as more real than sex without the drugs, and just where that calibration of different altered states in relation to drugs lies most importantly for you in your work as it is at the moment.
Shall I, do you want me to go? Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess, in that I was, in that kind of, when I was writing that, I was trying to, because I found like what I kept encountering and talking to people about their sex on drug experiences, and this is quite like a basic thing that I just found really interesting, was that they would always refer to like sober sex as like like normal sex or regular sex, or like standard, or something that set it as the norm. However, a lot of my research participants, especially because the research that paper was based on was what I did for like my master's, so I think I was like 23, 24 at the time, and I was obviously interviewing a lot of my peers, as you do. You kind of go through your own social networks. So the people I was interviewing were kind of in their early 20s, sometimes even late teens, and especially at that age, often sober sex is not the norm. Like, people are getting drunk on nights out, hooking up after that, or, to the point where I had a few kind of participants who had never had sober sex, or if they had, it was because they'd maybe had sex in the morning after getting like heavily intoxicated on whatever substances, usually alcohol, but sometimes more as well, the night before. So that was kind of the starting point. So you do have that hierarchy between sober and intoxicated states, and I think that really comes from just the fact that we don't really, you know, as a society value like pleasure for pleasure's sake. Like we value pleasure when it's been, you know, earned, like you've put in the work, you've done something and now you feel good about it. That's kind of legitimate good pleasure. But if you just, you know, take a pill and then feel really good, it's like you've kind of cheated your way to pleasure. You've not really earned that. You don't deserve it. And even though I'm sure many people do find pleasure that way, it's not really, you know, we don't look upon it kindly necessarily all the time. And then so you've got that sober intoxicated hierarchy, but then within like sex on drugs there is also completely a hierarchy too. And I think it's interesting with the kind of psychedelics focus is that couples, long-standing couples having sex on psychedelics in a way that's meant to enhance, you know, their communication or relationship in some way is right at the top of that hierarchy, whereas, you know, anonymous sex cruising on like G or crystal meth is like at the bottom, because, you know, like again, like, and this ties into so many different privileges. It ties into, you know, the fact that in general psychedelics are kind of seen as better than other drugs, like, you know, like somehow superior. You know, I'm not saying that everyone would agree with that at all, but, you know, in the kind of the drug conversation, they're seen as the least harmful. You know, they have therapeutic potential. They're in that way legitimized. You know, there's research being done to show like, look, these things are great. And obviously that comes into other drugs a bit, like MDMA and ketamine and stuff like that. So like obviously it's more complicated than that. But yeah, like I think it's interesting that, like, yeah, hierarchy of substances and sex on those substances as well. And yeah, and I think and people have a lot of concerns about, like, you know, I come back to GHB a lot because, like, I find it such like a fascinating drug, with like the stigma around it and like the fact that, you know, I myself am ambivalent about it. Like, so, and again, I'm coming off the back of just being at that club Adonis the other day, because I like the dark room there, honestly, like, and consent, like, it's just wild. Like one of my friends had a real, like a deeply troubling experience there the other day. Again, like slight content warning, it kind of goes into like non-consent, like not, I don't think this is deep, I just want to like give a bit of a heads up. Yeah, they'd just taken like a shot of G, a bump of mephedrone or MCAT, I don't know, it's like quite often used in those spaces. They'd been taking speed, I think they were on acid as well, they were on a lot of drugs. It's a very druggy party. And they decided to wander into the dark room. And there are multiple ways you can use a dark room. You can go in with a partner and like go in, have sex, do that. Or you can kind of go in and see what you'll find in there. Like, you know, go in with the intention to have sex with someone, but you won't necessarily know them. And that's what they did. They went in and they found, they kind of sat around kind of observing, looking what was going on. Like I said, in those spaces, consent is often just having an erection or just making eye contact with people. And again, like it's a very cis gay men dominated space, which is important. And also I would say it's a very muscle gay space as well. So like body image is like a real issue there. And my friend is someone who kind of struggles with the muscle gay vibe because they have like body image issues where, you know, they are non-binary, but they can pass, like, I don't like that term, but it's important here, to as a cis gay man. So they can be read as like the same in that space, but at the same time, they're not like, you know, massively muscly and built like a lot of the guys there. So we kind of sat down, there was, as they would term, a muscle gay next to them. And at first the guy wasn't really interested. And then they did start engaging and then they had sex. Then my friend went and had sex with some other people, looked back and the guy was passed out. And my friend is like, goes over and says, like, babe, you're passed out. Like you've passed out from G, like you need to wake up, you need to wake up. The guy wakes up and he's like, oh, yeah. Then my friend goes away. And bearing in mind as well, my friend is also on G and on a lot of other drugs, heavily intoxicated themselves, goes off, interacts with other people, looks over again. They don't have a concept of time because they're on acid either as well. But at some point they see that you know, this person's passed out again. They go over, they go, babe, you've been passed out again on G, you need to wake up, blah, blah, blah. Happens again, happens a third time. And then the fourth time it happens, the guy goes, oh, sorry, did I fall asleep while we were having sex? And the whole interaction just changes. And my friend is like, okay, and like what they wanted to do was take this boy outside, like go have a cigarette and just debrief, just chat, make sure the guy's okay. Come to a situation where they both feel okay about what's just happened. It's not clear that the guy feels bad about what's just happened. Like he kind of just asked that question, but he wasn't asking the question like, oh my God, did you have sex with me while I was asleep? He wasn't asking that. But my friend then goes, okay, well, I feel like I did not consent to having sex with someone on that much G, but I did not know he was on that much G, and I am on G myself. But also I feel weird now about that person's consent. Like I simultaneously feel like a predator, but also like my own consent has been violated because I did not know that. But again, like there's banging techno playing, like no one can hear anything. They can't communicate. There's no welfare officers in this space. Like, because honestly, no one would want to do it there. And it's just like that club, and it comes back to context again, because that club has literally set the conditions. They have facilitated that encounter. They have set up a party for men to have chemsex in, basically. That's what they've done, but refused to take any responsibility for it. They say, no, you can't use G here, we don't allow it, and they don't have welfare staff. But they know that people are going to take G, but they just want to wash their hands of responsibility. So it's like the context has facilitated that encounter, and there are people within it, and it's just like, it's just a whole mess. And we were just thinking, like, afterwards, we kind of came back to our house afterwards and debriefed. And my friend was thinking, you know, in the past, if this was 7 years ago, I would have like started an anonymous Instagram account and started getting people to like load in all the loads of like comments about how this party is like problematic and this and that, but they're not going to do it now because they don't want to deal with the social consequences of calling them out in that way, which I think is fair enough. I actually can't remember how I got onto it's the hierarchy of drugs. Yeah, because it's just like, I think G is just so, and the party's attitude towards G totally reflects that. They don't ban any drug other than G. It's only G, even though all the drugs are illegal. It's only G that they explicitly have a problem with. If you get caught with G, you get kicked out. If you get caught with ketamine, MDMA, speed, you don't get kicked out. It's only G, and you're called selfish if you use G. Like they are always posting on their Instagram stories, you know, everyone who's using G here is so selfish, you're just ruining it for everyone else. But it's like, you have created a party for people to take G, and it's the G oh my God, the G-iest party in London. Like I don't know one where more is consumed. It's crazy. But yeah, so I think, yeah, hierarchy of drugs basically, and the implications are really severe, because if, you know, if maybe we were a bit more accepting or forgiving about G and more, you know, aware that people were going to use it, then maybe we could, I don't know what we could have done to prevent that sexual encounter from happening, to be honest. I don't know what we could have done, but there are surely some contextual things that should have been put in place in order to avoid that happening. And that like would not have happened in the same way if someone was just, you know, on loads of MDMA, because that doesn't make you pass out in the way that G does. So it's something specific about the drugs, but it's also like the social cultural attitudes around it that shape those experiences too. Yeah, but I think that's probably all I have to say on that.
It's so interesting, and such I love that your examples, Alex, are just so complex and based in, you know, it's taking me back to like my 20s and night lifetimes, and that kind of complexity and messiness that is so much more difficult to really like figure out, well, what do you do if this is a party where people want to come and take G, and how do you, is there a way to set the stage or set expectations or have a way for people to kind of decide what they're up for doing before they take the G, and have a way of communicating that? So, you know, like that would be in my ideal, you know, brain. I'll just wind back to some of my experience as a somatic sex educator. So we do work that's like one-on-one with folks on a massage table. It's one-way touch from me to the client. I'm fully clothed. They're in whatever state of undress they're comfortable with. And the idea is that we provide erotic touch for the purposes of education, healing, and pleasure. And so some people are coming to, you know, work with you know, pelvic pain issues or scar tissue from trauma. Some people are coming because they've never explored their G-spot, and some people are coming because they just want to have a lovely erotic space to explore in without the pressure of a two-way interaction, and with some guidance, and being in a space that's completely guided by the person on the table. Like it's not like some of these like neo-tantric modalities where I'm going to be intuitively deciding that they now want their breast touched. They're going to have to ask me if they want that. So it's like a very consent forward, trauma informed space. And so one of the rules that we kind of came up with, or guidelines, or kind of a living code of ethics that we have in our profession, is really we actually see erotic trance and orgasm as altered states. Like we don't and I fully believe that to be true. I mean, if you think about sort of the state of arousal and then deeper into a sexual encounter, those are states that are non-normative. That's not our everyday kind of usually way of perceiving the world. And that's why arousal can kind of bring us to do things maybe we wouldn't normally have done if we were just sort of, you know, walking through the streets of London or something. So there's like that kind of different brain space that we get into, even supposedly sober, through accessing the erotic. And so our kind of practice as somatic sex educators is that we establish at the beginning of a session, you know, what's on the table for us, like what are the you know, limitations of what we're going to explore today. And the rule is that we can always down negotiate. You know, you could say, okay, I want to explore prostate pleasure today, but I don't want anyone touching my feet. And so on that, you know, you could always say, actually, I'm not into the prostate exploration after all, but you could never say, actually, I think I do want you to touch my feet. What we would say, if that person opened up in that state to saying, actually, I think I would like someone to explore my feet, I would say to them, that's so wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with me. And we can definitely look to explore that in our next session together. Let's see how you feel when we come back out of this state about adding that into the menu for next time. And it's just a way of acknowledging that what we open to wanting to explore in the kind of heavily altered states isn't always something that we're going to feel very comfortable with when we're sort of back at our baseline everyday consciousness. And so it's kind of something that's hard to instill in the real world situations outside of this container, but I think it's something that I think about in terms of ways to create a little bit more safety. And it's interesting because I've seen a lot of conversation, and especially in psychedelic spaces. I think it was particularly around some of the therapeutic spaces about, you know, what happens if you're sitting for someone on MDMA and they said they didn't want any touch during the session, and then they actually really want you to hold their hand or put your arm around them during a session, and what the ethics of that are. And I've seen, you know, people talk a lot about like, you know, it's, you know, but it would be a wasted healing opportunity, or, you know, to miss that opening that they're finally feeling receptive to, or that you know, that they can be harmed by not receiving that touch that they wanted in that moment. And I have a lot of sympathy for those feelings, but ultimately what I know from my embodiment practices and with clients is that there are ways to language and create expectations before setting the container that can help mitigate the downsides of doing that. But there is nothing that can actually make up for later if that client or participant later feels that they weren't really wanting touch, or that they had, you know, had their consent in some way violated once they were in that state. That is a kind of new form of trauma or violation that then has to be processed. And so we always kind of like land on the better safe than sorry piece, and what can help kind of hold that is to set the expectation at the beginning of the session that, okay, that means that if you do decide, you know, in the middle of the session that you're wanting some touch or wanting to hold hands, I'm not going to be able to change our agreements from now, and I'll just remind you of our agreement, but I'm always going to be there as a loving presence, you know, within the, and so, okay, that's like all very formal settings of, you know, practitioner client, you know, therapeutic somatic sex education. How do you translate that into everyday life, nightclub situations? I don't think you can be quite that prescriptive, and there's not the responsibility, right, of one person holding space for the other. But could there be what would it be like if before, I know some play parties that happen in the US will have like a 2-hour or 1-hour like pre-party consent workshop that's mandatory and that people come to just to sort of get baseline understanding. And sometimes it's more complex or, you know, expansive understandings around consent than others. But I always wonder like what would happen if part of that was this guided somatic exercise to feel into like, what am I open to exploring tonight? And maybe there's some basic color coded sticker or tag someone wears or something just to create like baseline levels. And then of course those things can change and you might want to pull one of the stickers off your label, or you might not want to do the things you thought you were up for, but just to create something where once you're really deep into whatever altered state, arousal, G, whatever acid that you're on, you can have some kind of tether from the everyday consciousness that you were in and your intentions for the evening to come back to help prevent some of the experiences that I think can be kind of re-traumatizing, even when we are we're engaging from a deeply altered state, potentially consensually in that moment. But yeah, just super, super complex. And I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you both so much for such really full and incredible answers.